everyone, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. This week I'm going to be sharing with you the differences between living in a campground as opposed to a homestead and stay. I only have my personal experiences to go off of, so this is only my experiences living in a campground and a homestead and stay. Again, everyone's experiences are going to be different depending on where you stay. Okay, let's start with number one. There are constant neighbors in a campground, whereas in a homestead and stay, I was the only monthly renter, so there weren't many neighbors. The only neighbors I had were the homestead owners at the homestead and stay, whereas at the campground I had tons of different neighbors across the street, neighbors next to me. Every spot that you see had neighbors. Now this includes people coming in to stay, whether it's the weekend. Often in a campground I would have different neighbors that I'd walk outside to, and then they would leave. And then there are other neighbors who were there every single day and rented seasonal, or there was renters that lived there yearly. Now that said, it was much more peaceful at the homestead and stay because I didn't have all those neighbors and there wasn't all that drama like there was in the campground. That was a good move for me to move from the campground to the spot in Georgia. That is difference number one. Number two comparison. There are no AirBnb guests at a campground, and in the homestead and stay, since it was basically for Airbnb guests, there were different people there almost every day. So in a campground, there aren't really people renting other people's houses per night. There isn't anybody going inside of these houses to clean them. Everybody basically lives there or camps there or stays there when you're at a campground. And at this Airbnb homestead and stay, there were guests in and out almost every day. The people are more plentiful at a campground. There's just tons of people there, and you have new people in and out all the time at a homestead and stay. Number three, at the campground, golf carts are allowed. Granted, we can only go 5 miles per hour, but they are allowed. Almost every single campsite has their own golf cart. Now you have to imagine there were 320 campsites at the campground in Illinois, and it was on a 10-acre lake. To get around to all of these other campers and your friends, or a party here or there, or gathering over there, you would use your golf cart to get to them. People who didn't have a golf cart would use their car. Now in the homestead and stay, golf carts weren't allowed when guests were there. Number four, in the campground, we could use cars and we could drive around the entire campground whenever we wanted. Especially those people who didn't have golf carts, they would use their car to go to, say, a different campsite. Whereas in the homestead and stay, cars weren't allowed back in the area, so there was walking everywhere. Number five, speaking of cars, as far as a parking lot in a campground, there was a main parking lot by the store, but each of the spots had their own space where they can park a car or two and their golf cart. In the homestead and stay, they created a parking lot where everyone had to park all the cars in the parking lot, either parking lot A or parking lot B, and no cars were able to be driven or parked by the houses that were in the renting area. Number six, there were events every year and multiple times a year at the campground for the kids, for the campers, for family and friends. People were allowed to have their own little shindigs if they wanted to, say, rent out the pavilion or rent out an area of the grass, or even have a party at their own little spot. The homestead and stay, I don't know if parties were really allowed. I know each of the Airbnb guests were allowed to do what they wanted to do, and I could have guests if I wanted to also, but there were no events. There was maybe 1 or 2 events, and that was basically the owner doing, his thing. But as far as events for, say, kids or the guests, the campground had golf cart rides and poker runs and different Halloween decorating costume contests with pumpkin decorating. None of that stuff went on at the Homestead and Stay. It was kind of different atmosphere when it came to events and stuff like that. Number 7. The campground had a laundry facility for 320 campers that were staying there. They had 3 washers and 3 dryers. Not everybody would use these at the same time, but you were constantly waiting because all 3 were taken up, so you'd have to come back at a later time or beat everybody and go, say, before 7 o'clock in the morning. At the Homestead and Stay, they had 1 washer and 1 dryer, and we could do laundry whenever we wanted. Since I was the only one living there, except for the owners, there was only those 2 sets of people really doing laundry unless the owners had friends of theirs stay. So I don't know if any of the Airbnb guests did their laundry, but I'm sure they were welcome to. Number 8, in a campground, we were allowed to use tools. There were people building stuff every day. There were the workers there. They would be building decks. They would be fixing stuff on campers. Each of the spots, they could build their own decks. People were putting up skirting. Far away, you could probably hear a power tool or a drill or some sort, hammers going off somewhere in the campground. People were working on their cars, their houses, their campers because they lived there. That was allowed at the campground. It was not allowed at the Homestead and Stay when guests were there. The guests are there to have a nice time, so power tools and working on cars and all that stuff just was not allowed. When the guests weren't there, when there wasn't any guests there, that's when the people who lived there could work on their stuff, including the owners. Number 9, in a campground, I kid you not, there was almost a party every single day. Probably every single day at one of the campsites. If you think about it, depending on if it's weekend camping or seasonal camping, people are camping all the time, and it's their chance to get away, say for the summer, the spring, and the fall. You had parties going on, bonfires going on, people bringing food, gatherings, people coming from out of the campground to go to other people's parties. At the Homestead and Stay, there were no parties. Unless one of the Airbnb guests were having a little party amongst the 2 of them, there were no parties at the Homestead and Stay. So I didn't have any guests over. I didn't party at all, anything like that. And same within the campground. I could choose to party or not. I lived there, but I wasn't camping. I was actually living there, so my day-to-day life was not that party. I did get into partying a little bit too much there, so I'm kind of glad I'm away from there because I did not want to party like that every day. It was a distraction. So living in the Homestead and Stay was much more peaceful when it came to me getting the stuff done that I needed to get done. And number 10, at a campground, animals are allowed if you keep them inside your house as well as on a leash, say in your yard. A lot of people do have animals. There were a couple people who had, say, feral animals like feral cats. Actually, many campers had feral cats, so you had a bunch of cats running around the entire campground. A lot of them didn't neuter or spay their cats, so there were kittens being born everywhere in the campground. But as far as dogs, they had to be kept on a leash. At the Homestead and Stay, they have a no pet policy inside the Airbnbs, so animals weren't really there. But they have 26 cats, 3 dogs, and a chicken, so they let their animals roam around. As far as the Airbnbs, no pets were allowed, so basically there were no animals, whereas the campground had tons of animals. So in conclusion, these were my comparisons from living in a campground compared to a homestead and stay. Again, everybody's situation and living experiences in these places are going to be different, and I just wanted to share mine with you guys. Maybe it would help you decide whether or not you want to stay in a campground as opposed to a homestead and stay. Currently, I am living on a friend's homestead, so that is a completely different atmosphere than the other 2 that I just talked about, so stay tuned for that video. If you guys like this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button below and click the notifications bell so you can receive a notification every time I post a new video. I will see you in the next video. Number 2, there are no Airbnb. Number 2, there are no Airbnb. Why do I keep messing that up? And 1 washer, don't put that. It would be built blah. In the far, don't put any of that. Post a new video.